Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back in time to an age when your evening bath wasn't just a matter of running hot water and tossing in some bubbles. Imagine a world where stepping into a public bathhouse could be seen as both a luxury and a dangerous gamble, where people whispered about sin clinging to the skin, and where certain days of the week, yes, specific days, were considered absolutely off limits for bathing. You're about to step into that soapy, or rather not so soapy, part of medieval life, and trust me, you probably won't survive the smell. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and your local time down in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone's listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a cobblestone street, the kind where every step seems to rattle your teeth because the stones aren't flat, they're uneven and slick from last night's rain. It's morning and smoke drifts lazily from the roofs of thatched cottages. The air is sharp, the kind that cuts into your lungs, and yes, beneath it all, there's a faint human musk that makes you instinctively want to breathe through your mouth. This isn't because medieval people never bathed, despite the myths. It's because bathing was tangled up in rules that might make you laugh now, but in their time made a strange kind of sense. Bathhouses were actually quite popular in medieval Europe, especially in cities like Paris or Nuremberg. Some were private, little wooden tubs tucked inside homes, while others were more like steamy community centers, where people gathered not only to wash but to gossip, negotiate deals, and yes, sometimes do things less innocent. But here's the twist. You couldn't just walk into one of these places any day you felt grimy. The church frowned heavily on certain days of bathing, most commonly Wednesdays and Fridays. Why those days? They were penitential days, meant for fasting, praying, and reflecting on sin. Soaking in warm water was seen as indulgent, almost like sneaking dessert in the middle of Lent. Picture yourself stepping up to a bathhouse door, coin in hand, only to be shooed away because it's Friday. No baths today, the keeper mutters, crossing himself. You might argue, you stink, your neighbors stink, surely God doesn't want a whole city to reek. But rules were rules and they came with bite. Break them and you risked not only public shame but sometimes fines, especially if local authorities had linked forbidden bath days with disease prevention. Remember, this was a time when people genuinely believed that warm water opened up the pores and let in sickness like an unlocked gate. That belief wasn't entirely irrational. The Black Death of the 14th century had left scars deep in the cultural psyche. Many medieval people thought that because so many bathhouses had been centers of infection, crowded, sweaty, and sometimes doubling as places of prostitution, they must be dangerous in themselves. So laws and customs grew stricter. In some towns, Wednesday and Friday were scrub-free zones, while in others, the rules extended to the entire Lenten season. Imagine slogging through 40 days without a proper wash. Your friends might start treating you like a walking penance. But here's the fun part. People didn't stop getting creative. A common workaround was dry bathing. Sounds fancy, but really it was just rubbing yourself with cloths or sprinkling scented powders over your body. Think of it as medieval deodorant meets dry shampoo. And yes, sometimes the powders included ground herbs, orris root, or even just plain flour. You can picture yourself patting flour into your armpits, hoping no one notices the faint smell of yesterday's stew lingering under your tunic. Historians still argue whether this practice was actually considered effective hygiene or just a way of signaling, hey, I tried. Another reason bathing was controversial was morality. Bathhouses were notorious for being places where men and women mingled, sometimes naked, sometimes half-dressed, sometimes separated by flimsy wooden screens. The church didn't like the idea of temptation bubbling up in hot water, so restrictions were as much about sin as about sanitation. You can almost hear a priest warning from the pulpit. On Fridays, remember the Lord's passion. Do not soak in idle pleasure. And everyone nodding while secretly thinking, yes, Father, but my feet still smell like the tannery. Curiously, not all rules were restrictive. Some towns actually encouraged bathhouse visits, just not too often. Nuremberg, for example, had regulations requiring bathhouse owners to keep clean linen and fresh water, at least for their high-paying clients. But even here, bathing too frequently was seen as suspect. To medieval minds, moderation was key. Too much bathing might soften you, make you weak, or worst of all, vain. After all, if you were spending more time in the tub than at church, you were clearly sliding toward the devil's soap rack. Let's pause and imagine what one of these no-bathing days felt like. It's a sticky summer Friday in a bustling medieval town. The fish market has been going since dawn. The streets are lined with stalls of salted herring and baskets of onions, and the air is thick enough to chew. You've been laboring since sunrise, hauling sacks of grain, and your shirt clings to your back like wet parchment. All you want is a soak. Instead, you drag yourself home, splash a little cold water on your face from a wooden bucket, and hope your neighbors don't mind the aroma wafting from your doorway. It's a rule, but it's also a reality check. Sometimes you simply endure. Now here's the quirky tidbit you didn't expect. While most towns were busy outlawing bathhouse visits on certain days, some monasteries actually had their own private baths. Monks weren't exactly known for indulgence, but hygiene mattered in enclosed communities. And yes, even they had rules, like bathing only 4 times a year unless illness demanded it. 4 times. In a year, you probably take more showers in a week. Yet by their standards, this was disciplined and holy, because they weren't letting pleasure sneak in under the guise of soap. So when you hear that medieval people rarely bathed, remember it wasn't laziness. It was regulation, fear, faith, and a little bit of creative deodorizing. Rules about no bathing on certain days might sound absurd now, but in their world they were guardrails against sin, sickness, and scandal. And yet under all those layers of prohibition, the human desire to feel clean, to scrub away the day's grime, never fully disappeared. And just like that, you're left standing at the edge of the bathhouse door, wondering if you should risk sneaking in anyway. The water steams, the laughter of bathers drifts out, and for a moment you forget about priests, plagues, and penalties. You just want to sink in. But then a bell tolls in the distance and you remember, it's Friday. You step away from that bathhouse door, resigned to your fate of Friday musk, and wander into the heart of the medieval town. The narrow street opens into the marketplace, and instantly your senses are assaulted by an entirely different storm, this time of bread, onions, and sweat. Bread is everywhere. Loaves piled high in baskets, flatbreads cooling on wooden boards, bakers shouting prices above the din of chickens, dogs, and gossip. For a medieval person, bread wasn't just food, it was survival. A bad loaf could mean hunger, sickness, or even revolt. Which is why, believe it or not, there were rules for bread so strict and so bizarre that bakers lived under constant watch. Picture yourself buying a loaf this morning. You stretch out your hand, palm full of copper coins, and the baker eyes you with suspicion. He knows what you're thinking. How heavy is that loaf? Because in medieval Europe, bread wasn't sold just by appearance. It was weighed, measured, and carefully policed. If your baker was caught shaving off ounces or skimping on flour, he wasn't just in for a scolding. Oh no. He might be dunked in the river, strapped to a cart, or even paraded through the streets with the bad bread hung around his neck like a scarlet letter. Why all the fuss? Because bread was the backbone of medieval diets. In England, France, and across most of Europe, people ate bread daily, sometimes for every meal. Rich folks dined on fine white manchet, while peasants chewed coarse rye or barley loaves that could dull your teeth. But no matter who you were, bread was life. Mess it up, and you weren't just shortchanging a customer, you were threatening public order. Historians still argue whether food riots in the Middle Ages were more about hunger or about fairness. But either way, bakers were always in the crosshairs. The rules themselves were oddly specific. In England, the assize of bread and ale was established in the 13th century, one of the earliest consumer protection laws in history. It linked the price of bread directly to the cost of wheat, so that bakers couldn't cheat during grain shortages. If wheat prices went up, loaves got smaller but had to remain proportional. Authorities literally weighed bread at market stalls, and if a baker's loaf came in light, punishment followed swiftly. Imagine a town official, maybe the ale conner or bread weigher, striding down the street, scales in hand. He lifts a crusty loaf, sets it on the scale, and the crowd leans in. Too light, and gasps ripple through. The baker pleads, "The flour was damp, sir," but rules were rules and excuses held no weight. Soon the poor man is hauled to the riverside. With ropes and laughter, he's dunked in the water, sputtering while the townsfolk cheer. It's punishment, yes, but also a kind of public theatre. After all, who doesn't love seeing the greedy get soaked? And here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes bakers added a vantage loaf, better known today as the baker's dozen. Instead of risking their lives on short weight, they'd toss in an extra loaf for every dozen sold, 13 loaves for 12 customers. A clever way to avoid the dunking chair. You can almost hear a medieval baker mutter, "Better one loaf lost than one life lost." But bread laws weren't just about size, they regulated ingredients. In times of famine, people stretched flour with peas, beans, or even ground up tree bark. Some towns banned these practices outright, others allowed them but demanded honesty at the stall. Picture the market crier shouting, "Oat bread here, rye loaf there," so customers knew what they were getting. Of course, not every baker was honest. Some stirred in chalk to whiten their bread or dusted loaves with lime to make them look fresh. Bite into one of those, and your stomach might rebel for days. And yes, when caught, those bakers often wished it had only been a dunking. Now imagine walking through this market on a hot afternoon. Children dart around with crusts in their fists, dogs snap at dropped crumbs, and everyone's eyes are on the bread. You're hungry, but you're also wary. Will this loaf fill you, or will it land you in bed with stomach cramps? Regulations were meant to protect you, but as always, some rules were more honored in the breach than in the keeping. Interestingly, some cities tied bread rules directly to morality. Parisian bakers, for example, were not allowed to bake during certain holy days, so the smell of fresh loaves would distract the faithful from prayer. Imagine that, being told you couldn't make toast on a saint's day because God might find your appetite suspicious. And yet, when the fasts ended, the bakeries burst into life again, ovens blazing, smoke curling into the night like a promise of satisfaction. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced. Some argue they were heavy-handed, others that they were symbolic, a way to reassure the public that order existed even in hunger. But one thing is clear: medieval bread wasn't just bread. It was politics, it was trust, it was survival. So as you wander the marketplace, clutching your hardened loaf, you realize you're not just holding food. You're holding a promise backed by law, punishment, and the ever-watchful eye of your neighbors. It's a strange comfort, knowing that at least on most days your bread won't cheat you. Unless, of course, it's chalk bread. In that case, good luck. And as you chew the crust, still gritty with ash from the oven floor, you can't help but smile. The bread might be tough, the rules might be stranger, but in this town, bread is life, and everyone knows it. The crust of your bread still crackles in your teeth as you wander past the market stalls and into the wealthier quarter of town. Here, the cobblestones are swept a little cleaner, the houses stand taller with painted timbers, and the people walking past you look different. Their cloaks shimmer with colored dyes, their sleeves hang longer than seems remotely practical, and their shoes curl at the toe in a way that screams, "I have money, and I want you to know it." Here's the catch: you couldn't just wear whatever you liked in the Middle Ages. Oh no, clothing was heavily policed. There were rules, laws, and entire booklets dictating what sort of fabric you were allowed to drape over your shoulders, depending on whether you were a king, a knight, a merchant, or just some poor soul who spent most of his days knee-deep in mud. They were called sumptuary laws, and they existed for what seemed like a really good reason at the time: keeping everyone in their proper place. Imagine this: you're a humble baker's apprentice. You earn a few extra pennies and decide to splurge on a cloak lined with fur, rabbit, nothing too fancy. You strut into town feeling like royalty, only to be stopped by an official who peers at your cloak, frowns, and fines you on the spot. Why? Because fur, even cheap fur, was reserved for people higher up the social ladder. You're expected to smell of dough and ash, not to swish down the street like a lord. These clothing laws varied wildly by place and century, but the spirit was the same. Fashion was about hierarchy. In England, a statute from the 14th century spelled it out. Common folk were forbidden to wear silk, velvet, or ermine. The color purple, reserved for royalty. Gold embroidery, don't even think about it unless your family crest included a crown. If you broke the law, you could be fined, your garment confiscated, or in some cases, shamed in public by having the offending item literally cut off your body. And why did rulers care so much? On the surface, they claimed it was about morality. Dressing above your station was seen as prideful, wasteful, even sinful, but underneath it was about control. In a society where 90% of people worked the land, clothing was one of the easiest ways to instantly tell who was who. It kept the nobility visibly distinct from the peasants. After all, if a farmer could dress like a knight, how would anyone know their place at a glance? Picture yourself in a crowded church on a feast day. Rich merchants sit in the front rows, cloaks trimmed with squirrel fur, while peasants huddle in the back in coarse wool. The priest looks out, and he knows instantly who can afford to donate more. The clothing laws aren't just fashion. They're a system of instant labeling, like medieval name tags stitched into your sleeves. Here's your quirky tidbit. Shoes became such a problem that rulers had to step in. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the fashion of ridiculously long, pointed shoes, called poulaines, swept across Europe. Some were so long they had to be tied up to the wearer's shin with chains. Nobles strutted around with toes so long they curled like ram's horns. Naturally, this drove lawmakers wild. Peasants were banned from poulaines entirely, while knights were told theirs couldn't extend more than 2 inches beyond the foot. Historians still argue whether this was about practicality, or just a king getting annoyed that he kept tripping over his courtier's shoes. Of course, people found ways to bend the rules. If silk was banned, they might wear finely spun wool dyed a rich shade. If ermine was too expensive, rabbit fur would do, hidden beneath a cloak. And sometimes, laws were simply ignored. After all, how many officials could patrol every street corner measuring your sleeve length? You can almost hear a defiant merchant grumble, "If my wife wants scarlet, she's having scarlet." But still, these laws mattered. They weren't just about vanity, they reflected deep anxieties about wealth and change. The Middle Ages weren't static. Trade with the East brought in silks and dyes. Rising merchant classes grew rich enough to rival knights. Nobles worried that if commoners dressed too finely, the whole order of society would unravel. Clothing became a battlefield of appearances, where thread and color were as political as sword and shield. Imagine slipping on a cloak tonight. If it's wool, plain and scratchy, you'll pass unnoticed. If it's velvet, heavy and lush, you risk trouble. If it's purple, well, you might as well declare yourself king and brace for consequences. The The rules sound ridiculous to modern ears, but in a world obsessed with order, they made sense. Your clothes weren't just clothes, they were your destiny, stitched into every seam. And as you stroll through the town, past merchants tugging their sleeves self-consciously, past tailors haggling over forbidden silks, you realize sometimes fashion isn't about what you want to wear. It's about what you're allowed to wear and who gets to decide. The market noise fades as you wander deeper into town, breadcrumbs trailing from your pouch and the echo of velvet sleeves still in your mind. The air is cooling now, shadows lengthening across timbered walls, and a hush begins to settle that feels less natural and more enforced. Then it comes, a deep, hollow clang that rolls across the rooftops like a wave. The town bell is ringing, and with it, a message every soul in the streets understands: time's up, go home. Curfews weren't just for teenagers sneaking out to meet their sweethearts. In medieval Europe, curfews were law, and the bell that rang them was as much a command as a warning. In fact, the word itself comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire. When the curfew bell sounded, you weren't just supposed to head indoors, you were expected to snuff out your hearth flames too. Imagine a whole town darkening at once, thousands of candles pinched, fireplaces smothered, streets falling silent. It was bedtime by decree, whether you were sleepy or not. Why such strictness? The reasons were practical, even if they feel odd now. Open flames were the lifeblood of medieval homes, but also their greatest danger. Wooden houses packed tight along narrow lanes, one stray ember could torch a whole quarter. Forbidding fires after a set hour reduced the risk of catastrophic blazes. At the same time, keeping people indoors after dark meant fewer brawls, fewer thefts, and fewer awkward encounters in alleyways. You can almost picture a grizzled watchman leaning on his spear, muttering, "Nothing good happens after curfew." But curfews weren't uniform. In some towns the bell rang at 9, in others at sunset. In London for centuries it tolled from St. Martin's le Grand, echoing across the city. People scurried like startled mice, shop shutters slammed, alehouses emptied, and streets emptied until only the night watch remained. Break curfew and you risked a fine, a night in the stocks, or at the very least, a rough shove back toward your door. Still, human nature being what it is, not everyone obeyed. Imagine you're a young apprentice, heart pounding with the need to see someone special on the other side of town. The bell tolls, but you slip into the shadows anyway, hugging the walls, ears straining for the sound of boots on cobblestones. If the watch catches you, excuses won't save you. "I was fetching water" won't fly when your cloak smells of ale and your smile gives you away. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, curfew bells were also wake-up bells. Monasteries in particular rang bells not only for curfew but also to rouse people for midnight prayers. Imagine it, just as you've drifted off, dreaming of warm bread and softer shoes, the bell tolls again, dragging monks from their beds to chant psalms in the chill dark. Ordinary townsfolk weren't expected to wake, but you'd still hear it in the night, the reminder that someone, somewhere was awake on behalf of your soul. Historians still argue whether curfew laws were enforced with iron fists or mostly symbolic. In some cities, records suggest plenty of fines collected for late-night wanderers. In others, the bells may have been more ritual than reality, a way to remind people of order without truly expecting obedience. But even if half the town snuck candles back to life after the watch passed, the ringing itself shaped the rhythm of life. Think of the sensory details. The last hammer blow from the smithy fades, dogs curl on thresholds, and one by one windows go black. The silence feels heavy, almost unnatural, as though the town itself has drawn a blanket over its head. You shift uneasily inside your one-room home, the fire gone cold, the air damp with night. Beyond your door you hear boots on patrol, the creak of a lantern swinging, and maybe, if you're unlucky, a muffled cry from someone dragged off for breaking the law. Of course, there were exceptions. Traveling nobles often ignored curfews, using their rank as a shield. Inns might be granted special licenses to keep a candle lit for weary travelers. And festivals. Entire towns erupted into song, dance, and firelight long past the hour, curfew forgotten in the joy of feast days. Rules bent when joy demanded it, but on ordinary nights the bell held sway. And so, as the last echoes fade, you sit in the darkness, trying not to trip over your own boots, wondering how strange it feels to be ordered to bed like a child. Yet in the quiet you begin to understand. These weird medieval rules weren't about robbing you of freedom, they were about survival. Keeping fire under control, keeping blades sheathed at night, keeping fear at bay with a rhythm everyone shared. You curl up on your straw mattress, the day's smells still clinging to you, and listen as the watchman's lantern flickers past your shutter. Somewhere in the dark, a thief waits for his chance, but for now the law of the bell keeps the town still. And you, for once, drift into sleep without needing to be told twice. You wake to the sound of the morning bell, stiff from straw and sore from the cold, and shuffle out onto the damp cobblestones once again. The marketplace is already alive, chickens clucking, merchants shouting, children darting between legs. But today there's a different kind of gathering, one that pulls you toward the square not for bread or cloth, but for something far stranger. A crowd clusters before the town hall. People whisper, jostle, and crane their necks. You slip closer, and what you see makes you blink twice. At the center of the chamber, bound by a rope and squealing indignantly, is a pig. And beside it, a stern-faced bailiff with a scroll in hand. Welcome to one of the weirdest legal customs of the Middle Ages, the animal trial. Yes, in medieval Europe, animals could be charged with crimes, hauled before court and punished as if they were people. You might laugh, but to a medieval mind this made sense. If a pig killed a child, or a rooster crowed at the wrong time, it wasn't just misfortune. It was an offense against God's order, and order had to be restored. The pig in front of you is accused of murder. Witnesses step forward. It trampled the boy in the field. The judge nods gravely, scribes take notes, and you stand there wondering if anyone else notices how absurd this looks. But the crowd isn't laughing. They're dead serious because to them, justice must be seen to be done, even when the culprit has 4 legs. And this wasn't rare. Records survive of countless such trials. Pigs were the most common offenders. They roamed freely through villages, snuffling into gardens, barging into kitchens, sometimes biting children. When tragedy struck, it was easier to blame the animal than accept chaos. So pigs were dragged to court, dressed in human clothes sometimes, and executed by hanging or burning if found guilty. But it wasn't just pigs. Goats, dogs, horses, all could face charges. There's even a famous case from the 14th century of a sow hanged in Falaise, France, for killing a child, complete with executioners dressing it in a waistcoat to make the punishment more symbolic. Imagine standing in the crowd, the smell of hot iron in the air, watching a pig treated like a criminal. The line between justice and theatre blurs quickly. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes insects were put on trial too. In parts of France and Switzerland, towns took locusts or weevils to court for destroying crops. The trials went through all the formal steps: summons, testimony, deliberation. Of course, the insects never showed up, but that didn't stop the process. In one case, lawyers argued passionately for the rights of weevils, claiming they too were God's creatures with a right to eat. Historians still argue whether these trials were sincere legal acts or elaborate rituals to comfort desperate farmers, but either way, they were taken seriously at the time. Imagine the surreal sight: a bishop in full vestments standing in a field, solemnly excommunicating a swarm of caterpillars. Townsfolk watch, nodding gravely, as though divine words might really send the pests packing. And sometimes, when the insects moved on naturally, the ritual was declared a success. Faith, law, and hope all tangled together in one bizarre performance. Of course, not all outcomes were grim. In some animal trials, lighter sentences were given. A donkey might be banished from the village for stubbornness. A dog might be chained for life rather than executed. In some rare, almost comical cases, animals were acquitted if the evidence didn't hold up. Picture a solemn judge declaring, "The cow is innocent," while the townsfolk mutter about wasted time. Why did people do this? Partly, it was about symbolism. In a world obsessed with sin and divine justice, nothing could go unpunished. If a crime went unanswered, it was thought that God's wrath might fall on the whole community. By trying the animal, the town restored order, reasserted human authority, and perhaps found comfort in the illusion of control. But it was also about spectacle. Trials were public events, entertainment as much as justice. You didn't have Netflix, you had the pig trial. Children gawked, vendors sold roasted nuts, and everyone went home with a story. It may sound absurd, but so does sitting through 12 episodes of a show about cake baking competitions. Different centuries, different distractions. Now picture yourself drifting closer to the square, feeling the crowd press around you as the verdict is read. Guilty. The pig squeals, the bailiff ties the rope, and the crowd erupts, not in pity but in satisfaction. Justice in their eyes has been done. You turn away, unsettled, wondering how long before another animal takes its place in the dock. And in that uneasy quiet, you realize these rules, as bizarre as they sound, weren't really about pigs or beetles. They were about people, about fear order. And the desperate need to believe the world made sense, even when it clearly didn't. The marketplace hums again the next day, but your stomach growls louder than the hawkers. The smell of roasting meat drifts through the air, mingling with the earthy sweetness of fresh bread and the tang of salted fish. You follow your nose, tempted, but then remember, today is Friday, and that means meat is off the table, literally. One of the most rigid food rules of medieval Europe was the ban on eating meat on certain days. Fridays, Lent, Advent, sometimes even Wednesdays were declared fast days. Fasting didn't always mean eating nothing. It often meant abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs. You could still fill your belly, but only with fish, vegetables, grains, or humble broth. To break the rule wasn't just a matter of diet, it was a matter of sin. So if you find yourself drooling at the sight of a spitted goose, beware. Eating meat when the church said no could bring shame, fines, or worse, the dark stain of guilt. The butcher's stall you're eyeing, closed tight on fasting days, its heavy wooden shutters like a reminder of temptation denied. But here's the twist: humans are inventive, and when rules are strict, loopholes bloom. Enter the most creative workaround of the Middle Ages, beaver tails. Yes, you heard right. In parts of France and Canada, the Catholic Church allowed people to eat beaver tails on fast days because they were considered fish. Why? Because beavers spent so much time in the water. The same logic was stretched for puffins, barnacle geese, and even otters. If it swam, or at least pretended to swim, it counted as fish. Problem solved and appetite satisfied. You can almost picture yourself biting into a fatty, smoky beaver tail stew while the priest nods approvingly. Strange, but true. Other forbidden indulgences appeared too. In some places, drinking beer on holy fasts was frowned upon, though wine often slipped through since it was tied to communion. Spices, those costly treasures from the East, were sometimes seen as sinful luxuries, a temptation to pride. Imagine being told cinnamon was too fancy for your soul. No wonder people hoarded it in secret like contraband. And yet, even within restrictions, feast and fast played an important rhythm in medieval life. Ordinary days of porridge and rye bread were broken by times of rich feasts, roasts, pastries, sweetmeats dripping with honey. Then came the long stretch of fasting, plain fare, and empty bellies. The calendar itself was like a seesaw, teaching discipline by denying, then rewarding with abundance. For the poor, though, these rules often made little difference. Meat was rare on their tables, fast day or not. Their meals were bread crusts, onions, cabbages, and maybe a weak ale to wash it down. It was the wealthy who felt the pinch, their banquets disrupted by the church's stern reminders. And perhaps for that reason, fasting became a social equalizer. No matter how rich, you too must chew stale fish and pretend it fills you. Still, some rules seem almost comical. In certain monasteries, eggs were banned during Lent, leading monks to mark the day Easter finally arrived by boiling, dyeing, and feasting on them in celebration. You can trace our modern Easter eggs all the way back to those cloistered halls, where the craving for something as simple as a yolk became the highlight of spring. Now imagine yourself at a tavern bench, sipping thin ale, watching others argue about what counts as forbidden. A friar insists oysters are fine, they come from the sea. A merchant protests that swan meat should count too because swans swim. The debate swells, laughter erupts, and somewhere between piety and hunger, the line blurs. The rules weren't really about food alone. They were about control, about discipline, about proving devotion by what you denied yourself. But they also gave structure to life, a rhythm of restraint and reward. In a world without clocks or modern schedules, feast days and fast days marked time itself, guiding communities through seasons and years. As you settle back on your straw bed that night, your stomach still a little empty from the fast, you realize something. Hunger was a language here. To eat was joy, to fast was duty, and both together wove the strange fabric of medieval life. The church bells toll softly at dusk, echoing through the crooked streets, and somewhere nearby a wedding feast is underway. The smell of roasting meat drifts out of a timber-framed hall, laughter spilling into the night. But before you imagine yourself slipping inside, grabbing a goblet of wine and toasting the happy couple, remember this: if you had actually lived here, you might not even be allowed to marry in the first place. Medieval marriage was less about love and more about law. Rules curled around it like ivy, some religious, some cultural, all of them surprisingly complicated. For starters, the church forbade marriages between close kin, but close was stretched so wide it could ban unions between people as far apart as seventh cousins. That's nearly half your village off limits, unless you got a special dispensation from the bishop. Imagine having to track your family tree back several generations, just to see if you could date someone without breaking canon law. Historians still argue whether these strict bans were about genetics, politics, or simply control. But one thing is clear: love didn't always win. In fact, couples who ignored the rules could have their marriage annulled, leaving them disgraced and their children declared illegitimate. Talk about pressure. Now let's say you did find someone you were allowed to marry. Did you get to whisper vows under the stars with flowers in your hair? Not quite. A valid marriage in much of medieval Europe could be as simple as two people declaring, "I take you as my spouse," in front of witnesses. No priest, no paperwork, no white dress, just words spoken sincerely. But here's the catch: once said, there was no undoing them. Secret handfastings led to endless legal headaches when couples later denied or regretted their union. Imagine being dragged before a bishop while your ex insists you once held hands and promised yourself by the millpond. And the rules didn't stop at who you could marry, they crept into when and how. Entire chunks of the year were declared closed seasons for weddings. Advent and Lent, for instance, were considered too holy for marriage celebrations. So if you were in love, you had to wait, sometimes months, for the church calendar to allow your vows. Not exactly the most romantic of delays. The bedroom had its share of restrictions too. Certain nights, holy feast eves, fasting days, Sundays, were considered inappropriate for intimacy. Couples were told to abstain, not just for piety, but to avoid distracting from prayer. By some counts, there were over 100 no-go days in the year. If you lived then, your love life would have been penciled in around a very crowded church calendar. And then there were the dowries and contracts, the financial side of marriage. Families treated unions like business deals, land, livestock, or coin changing hands to seal the match. For poorer folk, dowries could mean the difference between marrying or remaining single for life. Wealthier families used them as chess pieces, forging alliances and protecting inheritance. Romance, if it existed at all, came second. Still, within the rules, there was rebellion. Lovers snuck away for clandestine vows, or met in secret gardens despite family objections. Troubadours sang of courtly love, of yearning glances and hopeless devotion, of passion stronger than law. And though society might frown, those songs carried hope that affection could sometimes bloom even in a world of contracts and bans. Picture yourself now in a smoky hall, watching a bride in a modest wool gown and a groom nervously tugging at his belt. Their marriage has been approved, their families exchange tokens, and the priest finally blesses their union. The feast begins, platters of bread and meat, goblets of ale, and you're swept into the dance, the air alive with fiddles and clapping. For all the rules and restrictions, here at least is joy, however fragile. You sink back into your straw mattress that night, reflecting on how strange it is that something so personal could be bound so tightly by law. Yet in a world where family, inheritance, and faith shaped every corner of life, maybe the rules made sense, or at least that's what everyone was told. The sun rises slowly over the marketplace, spilling gold across rows of wooden stalls. The air is thick with smells, spiced pies, salted herring, damp hay, and the faint tang of manure that never quite leaves the cobblestones. You wander between merchants calling out their wares, voices competing in a chorus that could rattle anyone awake. But here's the thing, even this shouting has rules. Yes, in some medieval towns, hawkers could be fined if they cried their goods too loudly. The reasoning was part noise control, part fairness. Nobody wanted one overly dramatic fishmonger drowning out the cloth sellers beside him. So instead of thunderous yells, you might hear a rehearsed chant, almost like a sing-song rhyme, keeping trade lively but orderly. Imagine living in a world where the pitch of your sales cry could get you dragged before the town bailiff. And speaking of fishmongers, Friday fast days meant fish was mandatory. This wasn't just about church piety, but economics. Whole towns relied on the rhythm of fasting to keep fishermen in business. If you dared to skip the fish stall on a fast day, the priest and your neighbors might notice. In fact, some towns required fish markets to stay open longer on fast days to ensure nobody had an excuse. You picture yourself reluctantly chewing a dried herring, while secretly craving roasted lamb. But the market was also policed for honesty. Bread and ale, the lifeblood of medieval diets, were so vital that authorities kept strict tabs on them. The weight of loaves, the strength of beer, all regulated. If a baker sold underweight bread, they might be tied to a cart and rolled through town as punishment, loaves dangling mockingly around their neck. Brewers caught watering down ale could be fined, beaten, or simply banned from the trade. The rules were harsh, but hunger and thirst made them necessary. Even measures themselves were checked. Merchants couldn't just scoop grain with any old bucket. The town inspected and stamped official measures to ensure fairness. If you tried cheating, the penalty could involve public humiliation, fines, or in severe cases, exile. Picture the scandal. A merchant caught shaving off an ounce, suddenly branded dishonest forever. Markets also had rules about location. Certain streets were designated for specific goods, meat in one, cloth in another, fish by the river. This wasn't just about order but sanitation too. You wouldn't want a butcher dripping blood near the spice cellar, or fish left to rot by the baker's oven. The medieval town might look chaotic at first glance, but behind the clamor was a carefully enforced choreography. Then came the seasonal bans. During Lent, not only meat, but sometimes dairy and eggs were pulled from stalls. During plague outbreaks, certain trades were restricted altogether. Tanners with their foul-smelling hides were pushed outside the walls. In times of scarcity, exporting grain was forbidden, lest the town starve. The marketplace wasn't just commerce, it was survival, tightly bound by law. And yet in all this regulation, you can still spot rebellion. A sly brewer slipping in more water than hops, a merchant muttering louder than allowed, a butcher sneaking cuts of forbidden meat under the table for trusted customers. Rules may have shaped the market, but loopholes kept it alive. Picture yourself finally at the alehouse after a long day. The bread is heavy, the fish salty, the beer weak but warm. You hear whispers of a merchant fined for shouting too loud, a baker shamed for shaving ounces, a fisherman smug because Fridays keep his purse fat. And as the tavern hums, you realize the marketplace isn't just about goods. It's about power, fairness, and the fragile balance that kept medieval towns fed and breathing. By candlelight in your straw bed later that night, you think back to the market cries, soft, sing-song, carefully measured. Even the voices here were ruled, as though the entire town lived inside invisible lines. And somehow those rules stitch together chaos into order, at least most of the time. The sun has dipped low, and shadows stretch across the narrow streets as you find yourself walking past a quiet graveyard. The smell of damp earth mingles with the faint smoke of cooking fires from nearby homes. Tombstones tilt slightly, moss crawling across carved names, and the air feels heavy with the unspoken rules of the dead. In the Middle Ages, how you lived wasn't the only thing governed by law. How you died were buried, and remembered carried its own web of strange restrictions. First, burial wasn't simply about digging a hole and lowering a coffin. Certain people were allowed in consecrated ground, while others were not. Criminals, suicides, or those excommunicated might be denied churchyard burials altogether, forced instead to rest at crossroads or outside consecrated land. You imagine standing by such a grave, the chill brushing your neck, realizing that even in death, society enforced order. Even where burial was allowed, location mattered. Nobles often had crypts or family plots within churches, while peasants lined up in the outskirts, their graves simple pits. Historians still argue whether this was about social hierarchy, hygiene, or simply the church reminding everyone of their place in life and in death, but you can see it clearly. A town's dead were as structured as its living population. Then there were the rules about the body itself. Embalming was rare and sometimes regulated. In some areas, priests insisted bodies be washed, dressed, and positioned facing east, toward Jerusalem, the rising sun and salvation itself. Imagine the awkward ritual. Careful hands aligning the corpse, linen folds neat, and prayers whispered softly, while you try not to think about the smell of decay creeping into the room. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of Europe, the dead could be tried posthumously. If someone had committed a serious crime, the corpse might be exhumed and symbolically punished, sometimes burned or humiliated. One infamous case involved a bishop who presided over a trial of a corpse for heresy, commanding it be stripped of its clothing and publicly shamed. You can picture the crowd murmuring, some hiding a laugh, others shivering at the surreal solemnity. Historians still debate whether these trials were truly believed to affect the soul, or if they were performative justice for the living. Funeral processions also came with restrictions. Bells were rung, but only certain numbers of tolls were allowed, depending on status. The wealthier the deceased, the longer and louder the peal, signaling both reverence and social position. Poor villagers, in contrast, might be escorted silently to the grave. You imagine the contrast, one procession bright and noisy, the other quiet and somber, both claiming the right to mourn. Another curious rule involved grave placement and church services. In crowded towns, it wasn't uncommon for graves to be layered on top of one another, sometimes multiple bodies in a single pit. Officials regulated spacing to prevent disease, or at least to reassure the living that order persisted. Occasionally, bodies were exhumed to make room for newcomers, and their bones carefully moved to ossuaries. You almost see it as a recycling of death, pragmatic yet eerie. Then there were taboos about disturbing grave. Villagers feared ghostly reprisals if grave were violated. Desecration, whether by thieves, curious children, or grave robbers, was punished severely, even posthumously. Some towns required public shamming or fines for anyone who dug up bones for curiosity or profit. Even the slightest disturbance could spark panic, especially if livestock or household items went missing nearby. Finally, burials reflected ritual rhythm. Fast days, feast days, and holy days dictated when funerals could occur. A funeral on the wrong day might be seen as offensive or unlucky. You picture yourself arriving at a churchyard on a festival day, realizing that not only your presence, but the timing of the ceremony itself, carries moral and social weight. And as you step back from the graveyard gates into the fading light, the town around you continues its daily rhythm. Markets close, bells toll, homes glow faintly with firelight. The dead lie beneath the earth, bound by rules almost as elaborate as those governing the living. And you realize that in medieval Europe, society didn't just manage life, it managed death, wrapping both in ritual, law, and carefully prescribed respect. Lying later in your straw bed, you imagine these rituals repeating endlessly. Grave dug, bodies aligned, bells rung, communities reassured. It's strange, somber, and meticulous, yet somehow comforting in its structure. Even in death, the world had rules, and even in death, you knew your place. The sun has long vanished behind the rooftops, and the chill of evening presses against your shoulders as you wander toward the town square. Tonight, you aren't here for bread, ale, or even gossip. You're here to witness the theater of justice. In medieval Europe, breaking the law rarely meant a quiet night in jail. No, punishments were public spectacles, bizarre, theatrical, and carefully codified to teach a lesson to everyone who dared stray from the rules. Imagine standing in the cobblestone square, the air thick with smoke from torches, the scent of wet straw underfoot, and the low murmur of townsfolk murmuring in anticipation. At the center stands a wooden contraption, the stocks. A man's head and hands will be trapped within, his posture awkward, exposed to ridicule, laughter, and jeers. You glance at the bailiffs, they carry whips and scrolls, faces serious. There is no pretense here. Justice is raw, immediate, and strangely performative. These punishments were as much about social order as they were about retribution. A thief might find himself in the pillory, a drunkard dunked in the river, and a dishonest baker, remember the bread scandals, paraded through town wearing loaves around his neck. Even minor infractions could become public spectacles. It wasn't just punishment, it was theatre, reminding everyone of the consequences of straying from the town's intricate rules. And yes, some punishments were utterly peculiar. In certain regions, criminals were forced to wear signs describing their crimes, often embroidered or painted in bold letters. In France, adulterers sometimes had to march through town wearing their spouse's clothes. Imagine the awkward shuffle, the snickers, the whispers behind hands, public shame made real, physical, and unavoidable. Historians still debate whether these punishments were meant more to correct behavior or simply to entertain the town. Here's your quirky tidbit. Animals sometimes suffered punishments too. You may remember the bizarre trials we spoke of. Pigs could be hanged, goats exiled, even insects tried and cursed. And the principle carried over: if the law applied, spectacle was essential. Order had to be visible. The psychological effect was unmistakable. Watching someone endure public punishment was meant to scare you into compliance, teach humility, and reinforce hierarchy. But it was also communal. People gathered, whispered, and gasped. It reinforced shared values, the idea that rules weren't abstract, they were enforced daily for everyone to see. As you leave the square, the echoes of laughter and shouts fade into the night. The punishments linger in memory like smoke, a reminder that medieval life balanced precariously between law, ritual, and theatre. You feel the weight of centuries in the empty streets, and it dawns on you. Life here was strange, strict, and structured, but also oddly predictable. The rules, no matter how bizarre, gave shape to the chaos of existence. You step carefully over the wet sand, noticing the strange shimmer of black rock underfoot, dark as volcanic ash. The ship behind you creaks and rocks, its dragon-headed prow stark against the white sky. It's 985 CE, and Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for a bit too many disputes, is about to plant the first Norse settlement in Greenland. You can almost hear the whispers of history echoing through the fjord, people seeking a new start, a new name, a place to call home that's cold, wild, and unforgiving. The first challenge hits immediately: shelter. The wind whips sharply off the ice. And even your layered wool can't completely block the bite. Historians still argue whether Eric's choice of site was genius, reckless, or a little bit of both, but the fjord offered access to the sea, grazing land for sheep, and stone and timber for building. You follow a few fellow settlers, noticing how they test the sand for stability, lay down driftwood for temporary walkways, and scope out potential spots for longhouses. The air smells of salt, smoke, and sweat, a combination that somehow feels like home already. As you explore, you notice the odd, almost whimsical details that historians rarely mention. A small drift of walrus bones nearby hints at meals past, while a carved figure of a Viking god, likely Thor, judging by the hammer motif, perches almost comically atop a rock, staring blankly at the fjord. Some settlers whisper that these figures protect the homestead, others just laugh, saying it's easier than scaring off polar bears with bare hands. The work is relentless. You haul logs from the shoreline, muscles straining as frost stiffens your fingers, while others dig into the sod to create foundations. There's a rhythm to it, a sense of community, and yet you can't shake the awareness that Greenland is not Iceland. It is not Norway. Here the sea is colder, the sun hides for long months, and the wind is an uninvited companion. Still, there is excitement, a thrill at being on the edge of the map where no one has lived for centuries. You pause to look at the horizon. Icebergs drift lazily, glinting in the low sunlight, and you imagine the stories future settlers will tell of this day. How they first set foot on these shores, how the smell of salt and snow mixed with ambition and fear. You probably won't think about this now, but in a few weeks this frozen frontier will feel like home, or at least a version of it, built from sweat, courage, and stubborn Norse practicality. Even in this moment, there's a quirky, almost humorous element to survival. Someone is fashioning a sled from driftwood, and hopping it can carry water from the fjord without tipping over in the ice. Another settler is arguing with a goat, which, as you quickly learn, is just as stubborn as a Norseman in a longhouse debate. These small oddities, the animal antics, the makeshift tools, the whispered superstitions, lend texture to your first days here, reminding you that life on Greenland's edge is never just grim. By evening, you're exhausted but exhilarated. The longhouse frames rise slowly against the pinking sky, and smoke curls from small fires where settlers warm their hands and stew seaweed and salted fish. You sit quietly, listening to the wind and distant waves, feeling an odd blend of awe and terror. The world beyond this fjord is a vast, untamed mystery, and here you are, trying to carve a life from ice and stone. Remember that for all the adventure, this is only the beginning. Eric the Red's vision is still young, and the choices made today, where to build, how to hunt, which rituals to honor, will ripple through generations. And somewhere not far from here, a raven caws, as if marking your arrival, a small reminder that Greenland is not just a frozen wasteland. It's a stage for stories, missteps, triumphs, and legends yet to be written. You trudge through the snow, your boots crunching against frozen ground, and the scent of salt and timber fills your nostrils. Timber from the fjord is heavy in your arms, and the cold makes every movement slightly more laborious than you expect. This is Greenland, not Iceland, not Norway. Here, the ice seems to seep into your bones. Your fellow settlers are already laying the foundations for the longhouse, a place that will become your sanctuary against relentless winds, snow, and the occasional curious polar bear. You kneel, digging into sod and soil, marveling at the ingenuity required to make this alien environment livable. Vikings had mastered this kind of architecture over centuries, blending practical knowledge with stubborn optimism. Longhouses are rectangular, built from driftwood or timber, with turf walls to insulate against the cold, and roofs layered thickly with sod. Inside, a single central hearth provides warmth, a place for cooking, gathering, and storytelling. Historians still argue whether early Greenlandic longhouses followed the exact Icelandic template or adapted uniquely to harsher northern climates. You, however, are just grateful for fire. As you hoist a timber into place, you notice a small carved stone lying near the entrance. It depicts a tiny Viking figure raising a horn, almost smiling, or maybe mocking you. Fringe scholars suggest settlers may have placed such figurines as protective charms, meant to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. You smirk, thinking it might work just as well as scaring off goats, which have a troubling habit of wandering into freshly laid foundations. The process of building is surprisingly rhythmic once you get the hang of it. Sod blocks are cut and stacked like bricks, creating thick walls that will trap heat during the long, frozen winters. Wooden beams creak and flex as they are fitted into mortises, and a few settlers carve runes along the supports, a combination of tradition, superstition, and boredom. You probably won't notice it now, but these small gestures, runes carved over time, will become one of the few remaining markers of your life here, echoing centuries into the future. Inside, the floor is dirt, packed down hard by the feet of settlers and livestock. Sheep, goats, and the occasional cow will share your space, and their body heat is surprisingly welcome. Someone hangs furs along the walls, and you drape your own wool cloak over a rough-hewn chair, instantly feeling slightly less like an ice sculpture. There's humor in this adaptation. One settler has wrapped a goat in an old blanket, claiming it's for morale. You shake your head, silently appreciating the absurdity that even in survival, Norse humor persists. You begin to notice the quirks of longhouse design. The central hearth is large, smoke curling up to a hole in the roof that doubles as ventilation. Cooking, warmth, and communal gathering converge here, and you realize how vital it will be to maintain a steady fire. One misstep and frostbite isn't just a rumor, it's a real, lingering possibility. Still, there's a comforting ritual to tending it, poking at embers and listening to the soft crackle that seems impossibly warm in this cold, unforgiving land. Outside, walls gradually rise, sod thick and greenish-brown in the snow. The smell of earth and grass mixing with timber and smoke is oddly satisfying, a reminder that life can persist even when everything else seems hostile. You watch as other settlers arrange sleeping platforms along the walls, stack firewood, and carve hooks for hanging tools. Every detail is deliberate, nothing is wasted. Fringe historians speculate that some longhouses may have incorporated small shrines or ritual spaces, suggesting that religion was never far from daily life, even amid mundane chores. By mid-afternoon, the house takes recognizable shape. You pause, leaning on a beam, and take in the landscape. Fjords glinting under muted sunlight, snow stretching toward distant glaciers, and the small figures of settlers moving like ants around your construction site. You realize that each beam, each block of sod, is a small act of defiance against a world that doesn't much care about human ambition. Here in these walls, life will be fragile, precarious, but remarkably resilient. Even as evening approaches, your work is far from done. Roofs need layering, gaps must be filled with moss or clay, and someone is arguing about the exact placement of the doorway, practicality versus tradition, as always. You laugh quietly, thinking about the absurdity. Centuries from now, archaeologists will study these decisions, and the debates you have over a door will echo in academic papers. You probably won't survive long enough to see it, but your hands, your sweat, and your small frustrations are already becoming part of Greenland's legacy. As night falls, you sit inside the partially built longhouse, feeling a tentative warmth. The wind outside hisses through incomplete gaps, but inside there's smoke, soft laughter, and a sense of accomplishment. The structure is imperfect, humorous in its cobbled-together awkwardness, yet undeniably functional. And in that moment, you feel a spark of connection with every Viking who ever built a shelter in some far-flung, frozen corner of the world. You rise with the first weak light of Greenland's morning, frost sparkling like a million tiny crystals on the longhouse roof. The cold bites at your cheeks, but there's no time to linger. Survival waits outside, and daily life is merciless in this northern frontier. You pull on layered wool, wrap a cloak around your shoulders, and step out into the half-frozen world, where snow crunches underfoot and the fjord shimmers grey beneath the pale sun. Already, the smell of smoke from the communal hearth mingles with the crisp, briny scent of the sea, a strangely comforting perfume for a life on the edge. Hunting and tending livestock are your first tasks. Sheep bleat in a chorus that is more chaotic than melodic, and goats dart sideways, daring you to chase them. Someone hands you a harpoon, and you wade cautiously toward the fjord, scanning for seals basking on the ice. Historians still argue whether hunting seals was primarily a necessity or a ritualistic practice. Either way, your fingers freeze around the haft of the tool as you aim, a nervous excitement buzzing through you. The first seal slips away, smooth and fast, but eventually skill, or luck, wins, and a modest catch is dragged back to the longhouse. Breakfast is humble: salted fish, porridge, and a handful of dried berries. Fringe accounts suggest that some settlers experimented with crocodile dung sunscreen for their skin, but you wisely decide that smearing fish fat across your face is odd enough without exotic additives. You chuckle, knowing your modern skincare routine would look equally ridiculous to someone in 985 CE. Still, food is fuel, and you savor each bite, mindful that in Greenland, even a small meal is a triumph. Next comes work in the fields, or what passes for fields in this icy land. You trudge through rough, moss-covered soil, tending to small patches of barley and root vegetables. The climate is unkind, crops struggle, snow can return even in summer, and yet the settlers persist. Each furrow turned is a gamble, a statement of determination against nature's indifference. You notice frost-cracked stones underfoot, evidence of the relentless freeze-thaw cycles that sap both soil and spirit. Yet there's satisfaction in small victories: a sprouting plant, a patch of soil turned, a stone hearth safely stacked. Around mid-morning, someone calls for help with livestock. A goat has tipped over a milk pail, and a stubborn sheep refuses to move from a slippery patch of moss. You sprint, slipping once but laughing anyway, realizing that humor is essential to survival. Fringe scholars speculate that Vikings in Greenland may have developed unique animal handling rituals, sometimes treating livestock as both companions and spiritual intermediaries. You shrug. Your only interest is keeping them alive long enough to produce milk, wool, or a future dinner. By afternoon, you're repairing tools and mending clothing. Wool tears easily in the wind, and leather boots crack under constant exposure to ice and snow. You're grateful for ingenuity: patches, twine, and the occasional bit of ingenuity borrowed from Norse ancestors who thrived in Iceland. Historians still argue whether Greenlanders imported enough knowledge from Scandinavia or innovated independently. But for now, you patch, stitch, and improvise, aware that failure isn't just frustrating, it can be life-threatening. Social rituals punctuate the day. A few settlers gather to share stories, songs, or riddles. You sit on a rough bench, listening to tales of sea voyages, encounters with strange wildlife, and occasional skirmishes with neighboring communities, or sometimes just wind-blown misadventures. Laughter is thin but persistent, a balm against isolation. Fringe texts hint that some settlers believed storytelling invoked protection from spirits, or even luck in hunting. You can't help but grin at the idea of your own clumsy exploits being interpreted as mystical signs. As evening descends, you tend the fire, coaxing a stubborn flame to life. Smoke curls lazily toward the roof vent, carrying warmth through the longhouse and softening the sharp bite of Greenlandic winter. You share a modest meal with fellow settlers: salted fish, boiled root vegetables, and a few berries for sweetness. The camaraderie is tangible, a human shield against the indifference of the frozen world outside. You probably won't notice it yet, but these routines, meals, chores, animal care, form the backbone of survival, the invisible scaffolding that holds life together on the frontier. Nightfall brings reflection. You glance out at the fjord, silvered by moonlight and ice, imagining distant lands that seem impossibly warm and populated. In that quiet, you think about your role in this story: a small, fragile participant in the grand experiment of Viking settlement. Every task completed, every mistake corrected, is part of a narrative that historians still debate. Was Greenland a doomed colony from the start, or a resilient, adaptive society that simply faced insurmountable odds? For now, you do what you can, content with small victories, warmed by the fire and the soft hum of survival. Before sleep, you record minor observations in a crude journal: the migration of a raven, a seal spotted near the fjord, a strange aurora rippling across the sky. Each note feels significant, a personal contribution to a story that may outlast you. You curl under furs, the longhouse creaking around you, and realize that despite frostbite, hunger, and relentless cold, life here is intensely alive, textured with humor, challenge, and ingenuity. Greenland is harsh, yes, but for the moment it is yours. You rise early again, the pale Arctic sun barely skimming the horizon, painting the fjords in silver and muted gold. Today's task is less about survival and more about connection, trade. Greenland is remote, yes, but the Norse have never been content to stay put. You gather walrus ivory, furs, and a few dried fish, inspecting them carefully. The value of these goods is immense, not just for sustenance, but as currency in a network stretching from Iceland to Norway, and even to the courts of Europe. Historians still argue whether Greenland's exports were ever sufficient to sustain wealth, or were more symbolic gestures of status, but your hands feel the tangible weight of this economy as you carry your bundle to the shore. The longship is ready, creaking gently in the fjord as the tide laps at its hull. You load goods, careful not to jostle fragile tusks or puncture furs. The vessel rocks with each movement, reminding you that the sea is as dangerous as it is necessary. Fringe accounts suggest that some Greenlandic traders carved runes on their cargo as both blessing and label, an eccentric form of proto-invoicing, perhaps, but whether it actually helped avoid loss at sea remains uncertain. You smirk, imagining customs officers puzzling over a walrus tusk with a scribbled rune. Setting off. The fjord narrows, icebergs drifting slowly like lazy giants. You scan the horizon for other vessels, eyes sharp for both friend and foe. Trade is as much about diplomacy as commerce. A poorly timed arrival or misread gesture can sour relationships for seasons. You probably won't think about it while balancing your cargo, but centuries from now historians will debate whether these early Norse exchanges were primarily economic, social, or ritualistic. For now, your concern is simple: don't tip the longship. The voyage is surprisingly beautiful. The low sun glints off icy cliffs, seals pop their heads from the fjord, and the occasional Arctic fox trots along the shoreline. You inhale deeply, letting the salt air fill your lungs, and momentarily forget that frostbite is a real risk if you linger too long without gloves. Someone jokes about selling ice cubes in Iceland as novelty items, and laughter ripples across the deck, proving humor persists even when survival is serious business. At a nearby outpost, likely a trading station already familiar with Icelandic vessels, you barter your wares. Walrus ivory exchanges for iron nails, furs for grain, and dried fish for basic tools. The process is rhythmic, almost ceremonial, with nods, gestures, and careful measurements. Fringe scholars suggest some settlers might have included small offerings to sea spirits during trade to ensure safe passage home, a blend of superstition and commerce that modern economists would probably find baffling. You shrug, grateful for the extra luck, since Greenlandic seas are notoriously unpredictable. Back on the fjord, laden with new supplies, you reflect on the strange duality of these voyages. On one hand, trade sustains life. Iron nails become tools, grain becomes bread, and wood scraps become repairs. On the other hand, the effort required to maintain these connections underscores the isolation of Greenland. Every ship that arrives carries hope, gossip, and necessity, and yet weeks can pass without a single visitor. Historians still argue whether these trading networks were robust enough to truly support Greenland's settlements long-term, or if they merely delayed inevitable hardships. You notice the quirky details that historians sometimes overlook. A raven circles above the outpost, clearly expecting handouts. Someone has tied a small bell to a sled, presumably to warn wildlife or perhaps just to amuse themselves. These eccentricities, minor yet persistent, add texture to daily life. Trade isn't just exchange of goods. It's a space where humor, superstition, and practicality collide, creating a living tapestry of human ingenuity and adaptation. The journey home is quieter, reflective. Icebergs drift in solemn procession, gulls wheel lazily overhead, and you marvel at the resilience of your fellow settlers. Each voyage strengthens the settlement's lifeline, but also highlights the precariousness of existence here. One storm, one miscalculation, and weeks of preparation could vanish into the sea. You feel a profound connection to every Viking who dared to navigate these waters, sensing the courage, the risk, and the quiet pride embedded in each haul of trade goods. Returning to the fjord, you unload your new acquisitions and help secure them in the longhouse. The air is warm with the fire's smoke, and the smell of cooked fish greets you, a comforting reminder that despite distance from civilization, Greenland is alive with human effort, negotiation, and the endless rhythm of survival. You probably won't remember every tusk traded or nail received, but the act itself, connecting this remote frontier with the wider world, is a small triumph. And in these connections, both mundane and magical, the heartbeat of the Greenlandic settlement continues. You wake to a grey, diffused light spilling across the snow, carrying the subtle scent of smoke and salted fish from the longhouse hearth. Today, your attention shifts from tools and trade to something less tangible but no less vital: belief. Greenland's Norse settlers carry the weight of centuries-old pagan traditions, yet whispers of Christianity ripple across the fjords. You trace your fingers along runes carved into wooden beams, symbols of Thor, Odin, and Freyja, feeling the texture of devotion, superstition, and artistry all at once. Historians still argue whether the Greenlandic conversion to Christianity was swift, gradual, or largely superficial, but for now, the rituals are as real as frost on your eyelashes. Morning chores take a quieter tone. Someone hums a devotional chant while tending livestock, and you notice a small fire pit outside the longhouse, lined with stones etched with symbols. Fringe accounts suggest settlers sometimes left miniature offerings, food scraps, carved figurines, even bits of wool, intended to appease spirits of land, sea, or home. You smile at the tiny, almost absurdly delicate nature of these offerings, recognizing that in the harsh Greenlandic environment, small gestures of faith can feel like mighty acts of hope. Around midday, you participate in a communal ritual, a blessing of the harvest. Crops are sparse, but even a single sprouting root is worthy of reverence. You sprinkle water, mutter incantations you barely understand, and nod respectfully as a chieftain recites prayers that blend Norse mythology with Christian phrases. The hybridization of belief feels natural here, practical and comforting. You probably won't notice it yet, but these rituals are not merely symbolic. They structure the community, maintain morale, and even subtly guide agricultural efforts, embedding spirituality into everyday survival. During the ceremony, children scamper among the adults, curious and daring. Someone tells a tale of a frost giant spotted near the fjord, exaggerating its size and ferocity until laughter echoes across the snow. Fringe scholars speculate that such stories may have reinforced community norms and survival lessons, embedding cautionary wisdom into engaging narratives. You nod, secretly impressed by how humor, education, and ritual intertwine seamlessly in these moments. Afterward, you tend to personal devotional practices. You carve runes into a small piece of driftwood, dedicating it to protection against storms, misfortune, and wildlife. Historians still debate whether runic inscriptions serve primarily as magical protection, communication, or both, but in your hands the act feels grounding, purposeful. Each mark is a silent promise to endure, to witness, and to thrive. You glance at the fjord as the sun tilts low, icy mist curling over the water. A raven croaks overhead, perched atop a jagged rock as if surveying your devotion. The animal is a familiar presence, almost a spiritual sentinel, reminding you of the thin boundary between practical observation and superstition. Fringe texts even suggest some settlers believed ravens carried messages from gods or ancestors, turning everyday wildlife into sacred intermediaries. Even chores are imbued with ritual. Milking goats, repairing sod walls, or tending fires, each is performed with mindfulness, often accompanied by brief muttered blessings. You notice that gestures and words, even small ones, seem to influence morale more than actual outcome, a psychological reinforcement as potent as any physical shield against the cold. You probably won't think about it at the time, but these daily practices, humorous, solemn, and sometimes absurd, forge resilience that pure muscle cannot provide. As evening approaches, you gather with the community around the hearth. Someone recounts a story of a shipwrecked traveler from Iceland who found shelter thanks to Greenlandic rituals of hospitality. Laughter mixes with solemnity, as each tale reinforces social bonds and respect for tradition. You quietly sip a modest broth, feeling the warmth of both fire and human connection, aware that these moments, though small, are the invisible scaffolding keeping life intact in a harsh environment. Night deepens, frost glinting through the longhouse windows. You reflect on the day's blend of work, faith, and humor. Greenland is more than ice and fjords. It is belief made tangible, rituals grounding you against isolation and uncertainty. Even in hardship, these practices create rhythm, community, and meaning. And somewhere in the quiet, a distant wolf's howl blends with the soft hum of fires and the whispering wind, a reminder that the spiritual and the natural worlds are intertwined in this frozen frontier. You wake to a biting wind that rattles the longhouse timbers, carrying a sharp tang of ice and salt from the fjord. Today, survival is dictated not by enemies or superstition, but by the relentless climate itself. Greenland's weather is as unpredictable as it is cruel, and you quickly learn that preparation, adaptability, and stubborn perseverance are your closest allies. Snow drifts in unexpected patterns, frost heaves the earth beneath your feet, and icebergs carve with a distant roar that makes the fjord feel alive and slightly menacing. Historians still argue whether climate change or poor agricultural choices contributed most to the Greenland settlement's eventual decline, but right now, every gust, every frozen patch of soil, is a daily lesson in adaptation. Your morning begins with routine checks on livestock. Sheep huddle together, their wool ruffled by wind, goats cling stubbornly to the edge of the pasture, and the occasional cow lets out a frustrated bellow. Fringe accounts suggest that settlers sometimes sang to animals to calm them during storms, odd but undeniably effective. You mimic the practice, voice cracking, as you herd the animals toward the shelter. noticing that even small rituals or superstitions can have practical outcomes in maintaining both animal and human morale. Crops are another daily challenge. You trudge through partially frozen soil to inspect barley and root vegetables. Some patches have succumbed to frost, while others show tentative green shoots, stubborn against the odds. You dig around roots, adjust sod barriers, and construct makeshift windbreaks from driftwood. Fringe scholars speculate that settlers experimented with heated soil techniques using animal dung or stones warmed by fire, though whether this had real agricultural impact is still debated. You probably won't consider it yet, but every minor innovation or improvisation is a step towards survival in a world that seems designed to repel you. Midday brings hunting and foraging, another arena shaped by climate. You follow tracks in the snow, scanning for seals, birds, or small game, noting how ice and wind patterns influence animal behavior. Wolves stalk silently near the tree line, and a polar bear paw print makes you pause. Historians still argue whether Greenlandic settlers faced more risk from predators or from hunger itself. You clutch your harpoon and keep moving, aware that observation, knowledge, and intuition are as critical as courage. By afternoon, you focus on building adaptations. Roofs are reinforced with extra layers of sod. Longhouse walls are packed with moss and clay to reduce drafts. You inspect firewood stores, ensuring they are elevated and covered to avoid snow dampening, and double-check the hearth's ventilation. Every small effort feels like a battle won, a hedge against the inevitability of frost, wind, and failing crops. Fringe texts mention creative techniques, like lining floors with seaweed to insulate against cold, which you adopt with a mix of skepticism and hope. Even simple chores become exercises in ingenuity. Fetching water from the fjord requires sleds, rope, and careful footing. One misstep can dump a day's effort into freezing water. You watch other settlers laugh off minor mishaps, realizing that humor is as essential a tool as fire or woolen layers. Historians still debate whether Greenlanders' ingenuity in adapting to climate was exceptional or simply average for Norse communities, but in this moment, their creativity is palpably impressive. Evening brings reflection and strategy. You sit by the fire, the heat a fragile barrier against the cold, and consider what tomorrow might demand, reinforcing fences, tending crops, checking animal health, repairing tools. Every decision, no matter how small, carries weight. Fringe accounts tell of settlers fashioning snow shelters for temporary protection or digging root caches beneath permafrost, simple yet effective adaptations that demonstrate a blend of trial, error, and necessity. Night descends quickly. Frost glints through small gaps in the longhouse walls, and wind moans across the fjord, a constant reminder that Greenland is a world apart. You curl under furs, reflecting on the day, small victories against ice, wind, and snow, clever improvisations that turn hardship into manageable challenges, and moments of humor that sustain morale. You probably won't appreciate it fully now, but your responses to the climate, practical, creative, and occasionally whimsical, form the core of human endurance in this stark, icy land. As sleep approaches, the fjord seems almost alive, ice shifting with distant groans, the aurora faintly flickering on the horizon. You let your breath slow, heart rate steady, and marvel that life persists here at all. Greenland is harsh, unforgiving, yet adaptable, and so too are you, quietly learning the ancient art of living in a frozen frontier. You awaken to the distant cry of a raven, perched atop a frost-covered rock outside the longhouse. Its black feathers glint in the weak sunlight, and you can't help but watch as it surveys the snowy fjord like an aerial sentinel. Today, your awareness of Greenland's wild inhabitants is heightened. Survival here depends not only on warmth and shelter, but on navigating the complex world of animals, both domestic and untamed. Polar bears, foxes, seals, and even occasional whales punctuate your daily life, and the line between fascination and fear is thin. Historians still argue whether interactions with large predators were frequent enough to shape settlement patterns or merely occasional hazards, but you can feel their presence in every paw print and shadow. You step carefully through snow and ice toward a hunting ground. Seals rest lazily on the ice, oblivious to your cautious approach. You raise a harpoon, muscles tense, appreciating the strange thrill of coexisting with such formidable creatures. Fringe accounts suggest settlers sometimes left offerings, fish scraps, carved figurines, or small runes, to appease predators or ensure a successful hunt. You smirk at the thought, imagining a polar bear pausing to inspect a tiny carved Thor before deciding whether you're edible. The absurdity doesn't lessen the reality. Life and death dance closely in Greenland's wild spaces. Domestic animals offer their own challenges. Goats slip on icy patches, sheep huddle against gusts of wind, occasionally butting each other or your shins with surprising vigor. You learn quickly that managing livestock here requires more than strength. It demands observation, patience, and an almost comical level of negotiation. Fringe historians even suggest some settlers believed goats carried protective spirits, though whether this belief influenced survival is uncertain. You probably won't think about it, but each interaction with animals, tamming, herding, feeding, strengthens the rhythms of daily life and cements community cohesion. By midday, you explore a rocky outcrop along the fjord. The wind whips, carrying the scent of fish and seaweed, and you spot a fox darting across the snow. Its keen eyes fix on you for a moment before disappearing into a crevice, a small reminder that you are not the only observer in this frozen ecosystem. Seals slide gracefully into the water, and occasionally you glimpse the flicker of a whale's fin in the fjord. Each encounter is a lesson in patience, awareness, and humility. Greenland's natural world commands respect, humor, and sometimes awe. Even chores are punctuated by wildlife. While hauling firewood, a raven lands near your shoulder, pecking curiously at your gloves. You laugh softly, tossing a small morsel its way, realizing that humor and observation are tools of survival alongside harpoons and sleds. Fringe accounts note that settlers often incorporated these animals into folklore, attributing magical or symbolic qualities to ordinary encounters. You probably won't appreciate it fully now, but storytelling, superstition, and direct observation are tightly intertwined in Greenlandic life. As afternoon stretches on, you check traps and snares, hopping to catch birds or small mammals for food. Tracks in the snow tell stories, the passage of foxes, the padding of reindeer, and occasionally the heavy tread of a bear. Historians still debate how much these encounters influenced settlement layout, hunting strategies, or even settlement longevity, but every paw print and broken branch informs your daily decisions. Nature here is a teacher, exacting and indifferent, but also strangely consistent in its lessons. By evening, the aurora begins its faint shimmer across the horizon, painting the sky in greens and purples. You sit on a rocky ledge, watching the fjord's ice reflect faint light, and reflect on the strange intimacy you've developed with Greenland's fauna. Even danger is tempered by humor. Someone fashions a bear scare from old timber, waving it at the horizon with exaggerated theatrics, reminding everyone that laughter can coexist with fear. As night deepens, wolves howl in the distance, seals call to each other across the fjord, and the occasional raven cries overhead. You curl beneath furs, heart slowing, soothed by the rhythm of life and wildlife coexisting. Greenland is harsh, yes, but it is alive, vivid, unpredictable, and strangely familiar once you attune to its creatures. You probably won't remember each encounter distinctly, but the awareness of a living, breathing ecosystem shapes every step, every chore, and every quiet or filled pause in this frozen frontier. You awake to the low murmur of settlers stirring inside the longhouse, the scent of smoke and cooked fish mingling with cold, crisp air drifting through gaps in the sod walls. Today, your focus shifts from ice, fire, and wildlife to people, how Greenland's Norse community organizes itself, navigates disputes, and maintains order in a world that is as unforgiving socially as it is climatically. You follow a narrow path to the chieftain's hall, the central gathering place where decisions, debates, and occasional arguments shape life on this remote frontier. Historians still argue whether Greenlandic chieftains held absolute authority or relied heavily on consensus among settlers, but either way, the social structure is crucial to survival. Inside the hall, the smell of burning peat and roasted fish lingers, mingling with the tang of sweat from a dozen settlers already assembled. You notice the subtle hierarchy in action. Older, experienced settlers command respect, while younger or newly arrived settlers defer, learning through observation and small tasks. Fringe accounts suggest that some leaders carried carved symbols of authority, scepters, decorated swords, or even elaborately etched drinking horns, to signify rank. You probably won't notice it consciously, but these artifacts, like social rituals, reinforce cohesion and order in subtle yet potent ways. Chieftain rises to address a dispute, a grazing boundary crossed by a stubborn goat herd. Settlers argue, voices rising, gestures punctuating points. You realize quickly that diplomacy here is part negotiation, part performance. Humor is frequently deployed to defuse tension. Someone cracks a joke about the goat's alleged ambition, eliciting reluctant chuckles even in the heat of disagreement. Social cohesion in Greenland is as much about wit and timing as it is about raw authority. After the dispute is resolved, you witness a council meeting where larger decisions are made. Allocation of firewood, rotation of hunting duties, and preparations for the long winter months. Each voice matters, even seemingly minor opinions are weighed. Historians still debate how egalitarian these councils truly were, but you can see the delicate balance. Leaders assert direction, yet the community enforces accountability. Fringe scholars propose that storytelling, humor, and ritualized debate helped mediate conflicts, blending governance with culture in ways both practical and symbolic. Midday brings communal labor. You join groups hauling timber and reinforcing longhouse walls, tasks that are social as well as physical. Elder settlers supervise, offering guidance interlaced with anecdotes from past winters. Younger settlers listen, laugh, and imitate, absorbing not just skills but social norms. You probably won't notice how essential this is yet, but shared labor binds the settlement together, creating a rhythm that strengthens both survival and morale. Meals are another stage of social hierarchy and interaction. Around the central hearth, platters of salted fish, root vegetables, and dried berries circulate. Elders eat first, then those of lesser status, while conversation flows, trading news, advice, and occasional playful teasing. Fringe texts describe subtle rituals, passing bowls in a certain order, offering first bites to gods or spirits, and even jokingly assigning minor titles to particularly stubborn goats or misbehaving children. These practices reinforce cohesion, blending practicality, superstition, and entertainment. By afternoon, you participate in a storytelling circle. Tales of past voyages, encounters with sea monsters, and humorous misadventures are recounted. Humor here is not trivial. It teaches lessons, enforces norms, and strengthens communal bonds. You probably won't realize it yet, but these stories serve as both social glue and subtle governance, reminding everyone of shared values, mistakes, and victories. As evening descends, the chieftain invites you to sit closer, offering a simple cup of warmed mead. You listen quietly as strategies for winter preparation are discussed, realizing the settlement's survival hinges not just on firewood or hunting skills, but on collaboration, leadership, and careful negotiation. Fringe scholars suggest that Greenlandic social dynamics may have been more flexible than in Iceland or Norway, adapting to isolation and climate pressures. You see this adaptability in action. Decisions are made with input, tempered by humor, tradition, and shared experience. Night settles over the longhouse, shadows flickering across sod walls, and you reflect on the delicate machinery of social life here. Greenland's Norse community survives because individuals understand their roles, respect leadership, and deploy humor, ritual, and cooperation as essential tools.